Thank you, everybody, for coming. Hopefully, I can deliver some information here that's useful for you. The way that we'll run this is I have about 35, 40 minutes or so prepared. And then at the end, I have a couple of questions that have been submitted ahead of time. And if you have any questions that come up at any time during the webinar, put them in the Q&A. I'll get to them at the end. I apologize. I'm new to webinars, and so I'm not skilled enough yet to be able to answer them as I go. Maybe maybe a couple weeks down the road, I'll be able to do that. But we'll get started. So today the topic is the science behind gaining muscle for high school and youth hockey players. This is one of the most popular topics in the gym. This is one of the things that I get the most questions about. So I thought we would put together something that addresses exactly that question. The game plan for today, first, I'm going to tell you, for those of you that aren't familiar with PWHT, I'll give you a little bit about kind of our philosophy, who we are, what we do, that kind of thing. That'll be really quick. And then we're going to get into kind of the typical approach to trying to add weight. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the science behind it and what actually happens when an athlete is trying to gain weight. And then at the end, we'll talk about what the best recommendations are. So what should you actually be doing if your goal is to gain weight? Okay. And then after that, like I said, we'll get into question and answer and we'll kind of see where it goes from there. Okay. So let's see. So a little bit about us. Perfect World Hockey Training, or PWHT, our philosophy is to pursue and share the truth about off-ice hockey training so that you can train perfectly. And basically, we're all just a bunch of exercise science hockey nerds. And what gets us out of bed in the morning is trying to do a better job at off-ice hockey performance training. So we're constantly trying to push what we're doing here and push what we're doing in the classroom and all of the academic side too. The purpose of the gym is to bridge the gap between what we know to be true in exercise science research and how we actually train hockey players in the gym. And I'll talk a little bit about my background in a minute, but for my entire academic career, I've been really interested in why is it that we know all of this stuff, we have all these papers written, we've done all this research, but it's not how we actually train our athletes, and how could we bridge that gap? So that's kind of the purpose of the gym, I would say. I think we're uniquely positioned to carry this out. The first reason is that my background is kind of unique. So I went to the University of Minnesota for way too long. I got my bachelor's in kinesiology, which is like exercise science. And I got 2 masters in kinesiology, and then I got a doctorate in kinesiology. And all that whole time I studied some aspect of hockey performance training. My first master's was on long-term athletic development, which comes in handy for this particular talk. How do you take a 6-year-old and bring them all the way through their professional career? And I applied that to hockey. My second master's degree was in how the core muscles sequence and activate during hockey performance. So it was the first time that we had ever looked at exactly what's happening in terms of sequence and activation of core muscles during skating and shooting in hockey. And then my doctorate is on transfer of training. And transfer of training, it's sort of like the rules on how you would develop an exercise that actually impacts your sport. So if you get 5% better at the exercise, how much better do you get at the sport? And to me, that is what you need out of training. If you're training and it doesn't transfer to your sport, it's kind of a waste of time. So that's a little bit about my background. It's a little bit unique when it comes to being a trainer in a gym. The other side of that, I'm a professor right now. I'm a full-time professor at Wisconsin River Falls, and I am the director of a master's program in strength and conditioning, which leads into the next bullet point here, which is that our coaches are experts. So all of our coaches have gone through my master's program, and in order to be a coach on the floor, you have to have at least a master's degree. And then we have over 15 years of experience here at PWHT training hockey athletes. We started about 12, 13 years old, and we go all the way to professional on the men's and women's side. So we're not just trainers, we actually are exercise scientists, and we're trying to apply what we know about exercise science to our training. What we actually do, hockey-specific off-ice training and education. We train at our location in Edina, And then next year, about actually a year from today, I just looked at spaces today, we're going to be opening a new space in the Woodbury area so that we can serve the east side as well. And then the education piece, we have a YouTube channel, Instagram, social, TikTok, other social media. We're at PWHTMN. You can check out all the educational content that we have there, and we're trying to ramp that up. And that's why we're doing webinars like this. Okay, so enough about us. This is what you came here for. So I wanted to start off with kind of what I hear all the time in the gym. And what I hear all the time is athletes come in and they say, you know, my coach or a scout or my advisor, you know, they say I'm a good player, but what they're telling me is that I need to get bigger if I want to compete at the next level. And our plan is that this summer is all about the gym. I'm not that worried about on the ice. You know, I'm a skilled player, but if I want to survive at the next level, I have to get bigger. So that's what I'm going to do. And a lot of times at the end of this conversation, the player will tell me that they're really searching for what works for them. You know, I need to find what works for me. And that one has always stood out to me. And it took me a while to figure out what they meant by that. But what I've found is that a lot of athletes, when they look around, their buddies, kids that are a little bit older than them, maybe kids that are their age or even younger, they're finding success in terms of weight gain, where the athlete that I'm talking to isn't. And the athlete that I'm talking to is there's all this pressure on them to get bigger, and they're trying everything, right? But they haven't been able to find like the magic recipe. And that's kind of what the first couple of slides here are all about. So the typical approach, the plan that gets put in front of me by an athlete or a coach or an advisor or a scout or whatever is we're going to train like crazy this summer. We're going to go 5 days per week in the gym. We're going to focus less on the ice. You know, he's a good player. She's a good player. But what's important this summer, this has to be a big summer to put on weight, right? And so what we want is for all the training to be focused on mass and focused on hypertrophy. And hypertrophy is just the sciencey word for adding muscle mass. And so we're going to use hypertrophy methods or bodybuilding methods. And what that looks like is usually sets of 8 to 12 reps. You're lifting a lot of weights. You're trying to maximally fatigue a muscle. So there's usually little rest involved in this type of workout. So it's like it's pump and iron, right? You're repping and repping and repping. You're trying to fatigue the muscle. You're getting a big pump in your arms or your legs or whatever it is you're training. And that's sort of typical bodybuilding hypertrophy methods. And this is what is taught at the undergrad level. It's taught in a lot of master's programs, and it actually works. The catch is it works if you're a full-grown adult. And so the problem, and I can skip to the next slide here, but the problem that our youth athletes and our high school athletes have is that from a physiological perspective, they're not full-grown adults yet. And athletes cannot add significant muscle mass until their growth plates close. That's just a physiological truth. And it's going to be the hardest thing as an athlete, as a parent of an athlete, for us to wrap our heads around. And so that's kind of the purpose of this next couple of slides is to kind of talk through that idea. So what are your growth plates? Your growth plates are at the end of your long bones, and when they're open, it allows the long bones to grow longer. And so that's where you get your length and your height, right? And what happens as an athlete goes through puberty is their frame starts to expand. So they get taller and they get longer. And it's kind of a two-step process. So the first step is you add height and you add length. And then the second step, after you've reached maximal height and length, is when you fill out, right? So there's 5 stages to puberty. They're called Tanner stages. There's Tanner stage 1, which is where you just begin puberty. 2, 3, and 4 are in the middle. And then Tanner stage 5 is when your growth plates close and you technically become an adult. Okay. It's not until that stage, it's not until you're fully done growing height-wise that you have the opportunity or the potential to really fill out with mass. Okay. And I'm kind of spending a lot of time on this because this one takes a little while to sink in. So if you're not fully done with puberty, using bodybuilding methods, using hypertrophy methods, trying to train more and more and more in the gym is going to be fairly ineffective if your goal is mass. Now, if your goal is sport performance, if your goal is getting better on the ice, we can accomplish that. But if it's just to put on pounds, it's going to be difficult. So all of that is to say that hypertrophy or adding mass for youth athletes, and I'm going to say that I'll use youth and high school athletes interchangeably, but what I'm talking about is athletes that are pre-adult, so their growth plates are still open. It's not about training methods. It's not about a magical diet. There's no magical mixture of things you can do to really escalate the rate at which you gain mass. So now everybody out there, I'm sure, has heard the summer I put on 15 pound story from at least one person around you. And I mean, I've heard it from hundreds, but usually the story kind of goes like this. You're an athlete that wants to gain weight, and you're talking to people that have done it themselves, right? And you're asking them, what have you done? What did you do? And more often than not, they talk about, it was this one summer, and what I did was I trained 5 days a week, and I had this special protein shake, and I was super disciplined and really strict about it. And it was that amount of training and those shakes, that's what did it. But what they don't tell you is that the year before, they did the same thing, or they did a variation of the same thing. And the year before that, they tried the same thing too, because it wasn't like just one year they decided, hey, I need to put on weight, so I'm going to start working hard, right? Everybody's working hard all the time. It's just if your working hard happens to sync up with when your growth plates close, that will be the summer that you talk about that you put on 15 pounds. Okay. So that there's a large range of ages that can happen. For me, it happened when I was 21 years old. There are kids that it's going to happen when they're 15, 16 years old, and anywhere in between. And we can talk about the ages in the Q&A. But the confounding factor in this summer I put on 15 pounds story is everybody attributes it to the training they were doing or the protein shakes they were drinking or the bars they were eating or whatever. And it's just a coincidence. It's a coincidence that they were doing that within like a 3 to 6 month window after their growth plates had closed. And so that kind of changes the picture on when you're asking people for advice on how to get bigger, how do I add mass? Okay, so here's some real world data. What I used to do was I used to weigh my athletes at the beginning of training and at the end of training to kind of get a picture. We also took heights, and I was interested in peak height velocity and monitoring Tanner stages and puberty and stuff like that. And I actually stopped taking this data because it was so predictable. And we're at the point now where we kind of already know who's going to gain weight and who's not going to gain weight over the summer. But here's the data. So it's 25 athletes. They were all males between 15 and 18 years old. 11 of them went on to be state champions. 15 of them went on to be Division I hockey players. The training program was 16 weeks long. It was throughout the course of the summer. They trained 3 times a week, and the emphasis was on speed and acceleration. One important factor to take into account here with the training is that there was no emphasis on bodybuilding methods. We never ran a hypertrophy cycle, and we didn't have any exercises that were specifically put in place to put mass on our athletes. We don't use traditional barbell lifts at PWHT. We don't squat, bench, deadlift, Olympic lift, that kind of thing. Instead, we like to do more sport-specific training so that it will transfer to hockey better. And we're actually going to do a webinar on what it means to do sport-specific training, how to get explosive on ice in 2 weeks. And you guys will all be invited to it, so don't worry about that. But getting back to this, the training was all about speed and acceleration. Okay, so here's the results. The average weight gain was about 10.5 pounds. The range was 4 to 17.5 pounds. 13 of the 25 athletes gained 10 or more pounds, and 8 of the 25 athletes gained 8 pounds or less. So the question is, why did some athletes gain a lot of weight, whereas others didn't? And the way that we would think about this, if we're that athlete at the beginning of this slide set, talking about what works for me, is if you were in that group and you didn't gain a lot of weight, you would say that kind of training doesn't work for me, right? And if you were in that group and you did gain a lot of weight, you'd say this is the kind of training that works for me, right? And what no one takes into account there is that if you look at all the athletes that gained less than 8 pounds, they were all in Tanner stage 1 as 15-year-olds. They were all late bloomers. Okay. And if you look at all the athletes that gained more than 12 pounds, they were all Tanner stage 5 before they began training. And they had just gotten to that stage. And then the interesting part is in the middle. So in the middle, we had 8 to 12 pounds of weight gain. And those athletes, if you would have asked them if they were happy with the amount of weight they gained, they would have all said no. And they would have all said no because they actually looked skinnier and leaner at the end of training than they did at the beginning. They looked less filled out. And the reason for that was they were all in Tanner stage 2, 3, and 4, which means that they were growing in height. And when you add an inch to your height, an inch to your frame, you add a good rule of thumb is you add 7 pounds, but it's like somewhere between 5 and 10 pounds. And so these athletes were gaining somewhere between like 3/4 to an inch and a half in height. And that like stretched them out and it made them look like those string beans, right? And this is what, I'm sure half of you listening to this right now are in this position where you're getting stretched out and you've gotten really tall and everybody looks at you and they say, you need to put on weight. You need to fill out. But what they don't know is you're Tanner stage 4 right now and you can't. And your hormonal profile is totally geared towards changing your length, changing your lever arms. It's not ready to start putting on mass. Okay. So, like I said, we stopped taking this data because it's pretty obvious to us in the gym before the summer starts who's going to gain weight and who's not. And it just has to do with Tanner staging. And if you want to know what Tanner stage you're in, you can Google Tanner stage and there's signs, kind of like signs and symptoms, and you could Tanner stage yourself. So the big takeaway from this slide, the last slide I said that hypertrophy for youth athletes is not about training methods. And some of you heard that and were like, that can't be true. This is the slide. This is the actual evidence behind that. So we were not using bodybuilding methods, but our athletes that were Tanner stage 5 gained between 12 and 17 pounds in 16 weeks. And if you look at all the lit, it says that you can gain between 0.75 and 1 pounds of muscle per week. That's like the rate, the maximum rate that you could get to. And so these kids were all basically right on that maximum rate. They were right in that window of the maximum rate of muscle gain, right? So the takeaway from this slide is that you don't have to change what you're doing to try to gain mass, right? And the way I'm going to talk about it and the way I try to talk about it with my athletes is gaining weight is like a happy side effect to training and doing the things that you're supposed to do, right? It shouldn't be a goal. And I know a lot of you coming into this talk, it actually is a goal for your summer. And right now your head is probably spinning. And so hopefully by the end of this talk, we can kind of walk through it. But if you can gain weight, you will. Now, and we don't have to get too far into this, but there are differences in terms of responders and non-responders to hypertrophy. So some people, when they are able to hypertrophy, they hypertrophy at a really fast rate. So they're super responders is what they're called in the lit. And some people, when they're able to hypertrophy, they still don't hypertrophy at a super fast rate, right? So like I train Anders Lee. Anders Lee is a super responder when it comes to hypertrophy. And we have to actually make sure that we don't accidentally make him too big. He wants to go in to camp at about 252 pounds, no more, right? Which is crazy. And we have to keep him down. There's been times where we've gained too much mass, right? Which is crazy to hear. But so what I'm saying is when you can gain weight, you will, and you will gain it at the maximum rate. Now, what your rate is, no one has any control over. And when that starts, no one has any control over. Okay. So this is sort of the evidence and the rationale behind changing the way that we approach training, the way that we approach goal setting. Okay. So there's some problems with the typical approach. And remember, the typical approach is we're going to train 5 days a week. We're going to do bodybuilding methods. We're going to do hypertrophy stuff, all that. The first problem is bodybuilding and hypertrophy methods are not going to be effective for this population because their hormonal profile doesn't allow them to gain mass, right? Before we get into the next two problems, we need a little bit of context. So whenever we're looking at a training problem, we always have to deal with the issue of time. And there's the time that hockey moms and dads think about, which is like, how am I going to get to all these practices and games and all that kind of thing? And then there's the time that exercise physiologists look at, which is we measure it in exposures, okay? And an exposure is a practice, it's a game, it's a workout, it's any kind of training session. Usually they're about an hour, somewhere in that ballpark. And it can be for any sport too. But you get 8 to 10 exposures in a week. And this limit is the context that we have to look at all training within, okay? So you get 8 to 10 training exposures per week and no more than 2 in a day. And where this rule comes from is from empirical data from the Soviet Union. So they used to track all the training loads and all that kind of stuff for all their athletes from 6 years old all the way until they were Olympic athletes. And then they looked back through the data and they found how much is ideal and optimal and all that kind of stuff. And it turns out it's 8 to 10 exposures per week. This is a classic case of more is not better, okay? So why do I bring that up? I bring that up because if you could train an unlimited amount of training, then it wouldn't matter if you did hypertrophy methods in the gym or you did bodybuilding methods in the gym or whatever, and you were chasing weight. That would be fine because you have all the time in the world and you could do your other training at other time. The problem is that that's not the situation that you're in. You're in a situation where you're limited on the amount of training that you can do and recover from. So if you go over 10 exposures per week consistently, you'll overtrain and your performance will actually decline. If you go under 8 exposures per week consistently, you'll undertrain and you'll be leaving performance adaptation on the table, right? So what I suggest to all of my families is 8 to 10 exposures per week, shoot for that. You won't be perfect, but kind of try to make that your average. Okay, so the problems with the typical approach. I want to train 5 days a week approach. There are diminishing returns when it comes to sessions in the gym for a youth athlete. And if you look at the lit, right now what they recommend is 3 days per week maximum, and they say 2 to 3 days per week lifting in the gym. The reason that they make that recommendation has nothing to do with safety. You could lift 6 days a week. That would be totally fine in terms of safety. The reason they make that recommendation is because after 3 days per week, you get really diminished returns. So your fourth workout that week, you're getting almost nothing out of it, okay? So it's just not worth the time. And to put that into perspective, my NHL athletes that train here in the summer, they train 4 days per week. So there's really not a reason for anybody to be training 5 days per week in the gym if you're, well, let's not say for anybody. For anybody who's serious about hockey performance, okay? You don't need more than that. And we always have to remember that the most important thing is hockey performance. And what we do in the gym is supposed to supplement that, and it's supposed to help with that, but it should not be the focus, right? Now, you do more off-ice training in the off-season, sure, that's fine, but it's still not the focus, okay? Everything is supposed to support what you're doing on ice. All right, the second problem is opportunity cost. So let's say that you're only going to train 3 days a week, but you're still going to use bodybuilding methods. You're still going to use hypertrophy methods, and your focus is on gaining 5 to 10 pounds. Well, that's not going to work if your growth plates aren't closed. And for most high school athletes and youth athletes, that's the case. So those methods are going to be pretty ineffective in accomplishing your goal. But what you could have been doing during that time is you could have been training your nervous system. And there's sort of, you could I talk about it sometimes in my classes this way, but you could kind of look at it as there's two things you could train in the body, or two systems that are really important to hockey performance. One of them is the muscular system, right? And that's what people think of when they want to gain mass. I want to train my muscles. I want to get bigger muscles. The other one is the nervous system. The nervous system is what controls all your muscles. The nervous system is the reason that athletes get stronger, more powerful, faster, more explosive without gaining weight. And that's one that a lot of people haven't really thought about, is most people think that you get stronger because your muscles get bigger. And it's kind of like a 1-to-1 ratio. As my muscles get bigger, that's how much stronger I get. But for most people, like 80% of the gains that even an adult will make are going to come from the nervous system. So your improvements in force output, in strength output, in speed and power, that actually comes from the training of more or less your brain. It's more than that, but it's your whole nervous system. Okay. And so the focus in hockey performance training has to be on the nervous system all the time. And what's nice about it is if you train the nervous system, what I say is that all adaptation runs downriver of the nervous system. So if you focus on the nervous system and you can hypertrophy and your body thinks you should hypertrophy, then you will, right? If you focus on just hypertrophy and you can't hypertrophy, then you won't. And if you focus on just hypertrophy and you can, you'll over hypertrophy and it'll actually slow you down. And we'll talk about that near the end. Okay. So the problems with the typical approach are, one, we don't have enough time to be wasting any time in the gym. Two, if you're spending too much time in the gym, you're wasting time that you could be doing something else with. And I would recommend being on ice or playing other sports. And then three, there's an opportunity cost to using inappropriate methods. You could have been doing training that was making you better on the ice. And again, we're going to have a webinar in 2 weeks from today that covers basically that whole side of the story. Okay, so what should you do? The first thing, and this is the hardest step in the process, is you got to wrap your head around what we've just talked about for the last 20 minutes. And that is that if your growth plates aren't closed, you don't have control over your ability to put on mass. And if we could, we would do it. You know, this is what everybody wants. It would be great. And I would love to help you out in that way. But you have to understand that this is out of your hands. This has to do with what stage of maturation you're in, where you're at in puberty, and we have to let go of it. And at the gym, we use stoicism quite a bit. That's part of our culture here. And one of the main tenets of stoicism is to control what you can control. So the first thing you have to do is understand what's within your control and what's outside. And when you realize that it's outside of your control, you got to let it go. Now that's difficult because, well, for many reasons, but one of the reasons is because your coach is still going to be there telling you should get bigger. And your advisor is going to tell you, and your scout that is on you is going to tell you that. And what I tell my athletes is tell them that you're working on it. Because you are, all right? You are eating, you are training, you are doing all the things that you're supposed to do. You just don't have control over the outcomes. You don't have control over the mechanics of how to get bigger. And once you can, you will, okay? So that's the first thing, is understand that and let go. And if you have a goal of gaining 10 or 15 pounds or whatever it is, I would drop that. I would drop that goal. I would make my peace with it. And I would say that this summer, I want to get as fast as possible, because that's the separator at every level. And that is empirically documented in hockey research. But I want to get as fast as I can. And then the happy byproduct might be that you get bigger depending on where you're at in puberty. Okay, the second thing is you got to manage your schedule. And I talk about this in almost every presentation because it is the most important part about training. If you're doing the best training in the world, but you're not doing enough of it, it's not going to help you. And if you're doing the best training in the world and you're doing way too much of it, it's actually going to harm you. Okay, so you got to manage your schedule. The last piece is all of your focus should be on hockey performance. I always hear this, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to give this presentation, is this summer, I'm not going to be too focused on hockey. I'm going to be focused on gaining weight. That should never be the focus. The focus should always, always, always be on hockey performance. at this stage in the game, as a youth or a high school athlete, your nervous system is the most plastic and the most adaptable that it will ever be in your life. That means that you have the most room to improve in terms of skill, speed, power, and acceleration. And so those are the things that you should really be focused on right now. That's true of your on ice. So the highest quality on ice that you can get to be a part of, and that's true of your off ice. It needs to be sports specific off ice. And I'll plug the webinar again. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk all about that. Okay, so what about, so some of you are hearing this and you're like, well, you know what? What about when my growth plates do close? That seems like a great opportunity to really pack on the pounds. So you could do that. And this is actually what happens pretty naturally to most college hockey players. So if your growth plates close and then you focus on adding mass and you train 4 or 5 days a week and you do bodybuilding methods and stuff like that, you will maximize your weight gain. And the first whatever period of time, it could be first 3 months, it could be first year, it could be first 6 months, your weight gain will actually be the same as if you weren't focused on it. But if you weren't focused on it, I said all adaptations run downriver from your nervous system, right? If you weren't focused on it, once you hit the optimal body weight for your ability to produce acceleration, speed, and power, then you would stop gaining mass. So at first, you're going to gain mass at a maximal rate because it's going to keep making you faster, because that's what your nervous system is asking your body to do. But then that will taper off if you're doing sport-specific training, and you'll naturally lock in to a body weight that is the best balance of size and speed for your genetic potential. Okay, and this is the crazy thing about letting your body sort of self-select its adaptations. So if you're just doing sport-specific training, you're going to hit the weight that you should be at, and you're going to stay there. If instead you're focused on adding weight, then you'll override that and you'll keep on gaining weight. And what will happen is you'll reach a point where you're way bigger, but it's actually slowed you down. And I'd say 90% of my professional athletes, the first year that I get them out of college, they talk about how they feel way too slow and they're not athletic anymore. And we actually have to pull weight off of them. Now, what's nice is all you got to do is sport-specific training and it'll pull the weight off of them, right? Now, if we were training offensive linemen, like I used to train offensive and defensive linemen in the NFL, and we would do a ton of hypertrophy work because the requirements of their sport are crazy. They have to have more mass than they can actually carry in order to perform in their sport. That's just not the case in hockey. So what if my growth plates have closed? I still would recommend doing sport-specific training. I still would recommend focusing on acceleration, power, and speed, because those are the things that separate you at the next level. And if you focus on those things, you will gain the amount of weight that you need to. But what I see in most Division I college athletes that go on to play pro, the trajectory is that they overshoot and then they have to come back down for their professional career. Okay. And then this is just an analogy, because what I have found in talking with people about this topic is that at this point, their head is kind of spinning. And so I think this helps put it in perspective. But coaches, scouts, advisors, parents, everybody will ask athletes to get bigger. They'll ask athletes to fill out. They'll say, you got to eat more, you got to train more, you got to do all the things. But rarely do we ask our athletes to get taller. Even our shorter athletes, we might say like, man, it'd be nice if you were taller, but we never say like, why aren't you working on that this summer? And the reason that we don't ask our athletes to get taller is because we don't think that there's a mechanism for that. We don't think that there's a way that they could just work harder to get taller, right? But we do think that there's a mechanism for them to get bigger, to add mass. And I'm hoping that what this talk did was it informed you that there's not, okay? For almost all of the youth and high school athletes out there, for 80% of them, there is not a mechanism for them to gain mass in the short term, okay? And so when we ask our athletes to gain mass, it's the same thing as asking them to get taller. It's asking them to do something that's outside of their control. And There are some negative effects to that. So when you hold an athlete responsible for an outcome that's outside of their control, the first thing that it does is it negatively affects them psychologically. It's one of the primary factors related to youth athlete burnout, which is where they quit the sport because they don't like playing it anymore because there's too much pressure and there's too many things going on that are outside of their control, right? The only thing that comes from that is a suffering in performance, right? So, and maybe the summary of all of this is if we try to fight our physiology, if we try to get bigger when we can, if we train 5 days a week, if we eat all the protein bars and all that kind of stuff, if we fight our physiology, we're going to get worse outcomes. But if we understand it and then we train, kind of using our physiology, that's when we're going to get better and we're going to improve in the short term and the long term at a maximal rate, which is what we're always trying to do. Okay, so the key takeaways, kind of wrapping up. The first one is understand that muscle gain is outside of your control. Youth are different than adults. And almost all of the methodology that trainers use out there is from adult studies. It's from hypertrophy studies that have been done on at least college-age individuals. And I've read most of that lit, and it just doesn't apply to youth. The second major takeaway, and this is the takeaway from all the talks that I ever give, is manage your schedule. The golden rule is the way to maximize your development in the short and the long term. It's just that simple. And again, that's 8 to 10 exposures in a week and no more than 2 in a day. The last piece is you should always be focused on training the nervous system for hockey performance. Whether that's off ice or on ice, that's always, always, always the focus. All adaptation runs downstream of the nervous system. And we'll talk more about how to do that specifically in off ice training in that next webinar. Okay, so then action items. What would you actually do? So here's, I put together kind of like my ideal summer training blueprint. The summer training blueprint is 3 gym sessions per week where you're focused on the nervous system, you're focused on sport-specific acceleration, speed, power. 3 to 5 on-ice sessions per week. So where you're focused, you want the highest quality on ice that you can get, the fastest speed, the best players, all of that stuff, so that you can improve your skill because your nervous system is the most plastic it'll ever be in your life. And then the other 2 to 4 sessions, do something else. We're not at the point yet where we need to be specializing 100% of the time. And so you can do something else. You can play a different sport. Maybe you have a spring sport or a fall sport or something like that, or maybe you want to play something with your buddies. But that's a good time to be doing something else. Okay, that's what I have for you. So up next, we'll do a Q&A. I'm going to do a quick plug for anybody that wants to get to know the gym better. If you're ready to train with us, if you're ready to train perfectly, you can book a consultation at our website, perfectworldhockey.com. The way that works, we like to actually meet everybody that comes into the gym, start a relationship with them, and make sure that we're a good fit. We also want to make sure that the expectations of kind of how we train and what we expect out of our athletes and what you can expect out of us is really clear. So that's what we do in a consultation. We want to get to know you and then make sure that you know us before we make any kind of commitment. So if you want to do that, perfectworldhockey.com, there's a link to book a consultation. If you want to keep learning, the next webinar, if you haven't heard, is for off-ice training for on-ice explosivity. That's what we're going to talk about, dynamic correspondence. We're going to talk about how to train the nervous system. That'll be in 2 weeks at 8 o'clock. I'll send a link and a follow-up email with a recording of this. You can check out the PWHT podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. We're at PWHTMN. And then you can also reach out to me directly. My email is there. My phone number is there. It's the easiest way to get a hold of me is to text me. I'm okay at email, but I'm pretty good at text. So reach out to me if you have anything there. All right. For the Q&A, I can pull this up. So the ones that were submitted ahead of time there were a lot of questions about creatine. And so I'll hopefully give you a pretty good overview of creatine. There were also a lot of questions, and Tom, we have a question from you about supplements. So I'll kind of do a little bit of a supplement talk, and I'll make the caveat that if you want to talk to somebody in depth about supplements. I work with two really great nutritionists. One of them worked for the Vikings and the Twins before she went private. And then the other one currently works for the Timberwolves and the Wild. They're great when it comes to sport nutrition. And I'm happy to connect you, whether you train with us or not. Just shoot me an email or a text and we'll get you connected. So, creatine. What are the pros of creatine? Creatine will make you more explosive. It will make you better at repeated sprint activities. So that's when you do something really maximally explosive, you take a short break and you do something really maximally explosive again. That is actually hockey. Okay. So the pros of creatine are great when it comes to hockey. And I would recommend that hockey players take creatine. I actually would recommend that most anybody takes creatine because the newest research on creatine is that it might be one of the best ways to prevent Alzheimer's disease. So I take it every day, not because I need to be explosive, but because I'm worried about my brain health. So the pros are good. There is a responder, non-responder issue with creatine. So creatine is naturally occurring in pretty much all meats. And so if you eat a lot of meat, then there's a chance that you're already getting the maximum amount of creatine that you could. And so taking creatine won't actually give you any extra benefit, right? However, creatine is pretty cheap. And if you take, and the serving size that you want to take is a teaspoon, not a tablespoon. Big difference. A teaspoon once a day. That's all that you need to do. And if you're taking that dose, then it's harmless. There's no problem. So it's pretty cheap. The pros are good, especially for hockey players. There's a chance that you already have enough creatine in your system, but taking a teaspoon a day won't do you any harm. Okay. The cons, they're, let's see. One is you have to make sure that you get a good source of creatine. So what I would recommend is going to GNC or wherever you want to get your supplements and asking him for pure creatine monohydrate, and then making sure that it has a third-party verified label on it. And there's 2 or 3 different companies that do third-party verification. And you can talk to the person at GNC or you can look at it on Amazon or wherever you're getting them from. But get pure creatine monohydrate. So the reason that's in the con department is because if it's mixed with other stuff, that can be problematic. And you have to understand that the supplement industry is not really well regulated. And so you never really know what's in the bottle. That's where the third-party verification is a big deal. So I think creatine. So, okay. And then the potential risk really comes if you either take too much creatine. So I've had athletes that take a tablespoon 5 times a day and they become hospitalized. Or you purposely dehydrate yourself. And so every couple of years, you're going to hear a news story about a wrestler that died and they attribute it to creatine. And in both cases, what's happening is creatine is really hydrophilic. And so you could think of it as it like absorbs a lot of water. And so if you take too much of it, it'll dehydrate you. Or if you're not drinking water, it will dehydrate you. A teaspoon once a day is totally safe. That's used it's ubiquitous. It's used throughout sport. I think 75% NCAA athletes are taking creatine at that dosage. And it's very safe. You're getting it in red meat, in chicken, in turkey when you eat that anyway. So now the effect size, does it like supercharge you where you were really slow before and now you're the most explosive you could ever be on the face of the planet? No. It's a statistically significant difference, and that is really consistent in the lit. The effect size isn't like jumping off the charts, but because it's cheap, because it's easily accessible, because it's really safe, in my opinion, you might as well make sure that you don't take way too much of it. But that's true of anything. As far as other supplements are concerned, I'm not a big fan of really any other supplements. If you want to take whey powder, I don't really consider that a supplement. That's just a different form of protein. I don't have any problem with whey powder, casein powder. Some people think of those as supplements. I think of those as just like easier ways to get your protein. Chocolate milk is great. There's little yogurt drinks that have high levels of protein, that kind of thing. And without this turning into too much of a nutrition talk, the general rule is eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight. And that's kind of the protein requirements that you need. So that's the spiel on supplements and nutrition. And if anybody has follow-up questions on that, you can throw that into the chat. The other question that I got a lot of was, what are the differences in terms of putting on mass between male and female? And practically speaking, there are, well, maybe not practically speaking. In terms of how you should approach things, there's no difference. You should continue to be doing sport-specific training, train the nervous system, okay? What the results will be, those are different. So females will go through puberty sooner, and then they'll get to Tanner stage 5, growth plates closed sooner on average. It doesn't mean that a particular female will always be done with puberty before a particular male, right? But on average, females will go through this process sooner. When you finish up Tanner stage 5 as a male, your ability to add mass is way higher on average than a female, okay? A female, after they go through puberty, after puberty ends, will start to naturally carry a higher percentage of body fat. And a lot of female athletes start to kind of freak out about this. And what they think is that they're gaining like too much muscle, right? And they get really stressed out about the percentage of muscle and fat. And that is just a part of female puberty. So once, if you look on average, males will carry a lower percent body fat than females, and it has to do with basically backup nutrient supply for childbearing. So sometimes that pops up, and females start to kind of panic about my training is making me too bulky, that kind of thing. But a lot of times that's just the natural course of puberty. So I wouldn't change anything in terms of approach, but the outcomes will be different. And really, maybe the general takeaway here is that we don't have as much control of the outcomes as most people think we do. Training is an input stimulus, and then your genetics take that input, and then they create the outputs. And based on your genetics, your outputs are going to vary. And your gender goes into that as well. So that's sort of the male versus female. If you have more questions on that, let me know. Okay, so here's a question. Curious about options for strength training. Summer programs seem a little more geared toward all abilities. Great. If you have an incoming bantam and don't want them getting destroyed their first year, I'd like to find something a little more focused. So I can't speak about other places. So the question is about how do you gear training to different levels, right? What we do in our gym is we actually train our bantam through high school all together. And what we do is we adjust the types of exercises that they're doing. So all of our exercises are trying to accomplish a particular goal. And we can scale those exercises up and down based on the ability level of the athlete. And then we adjust the load. And that's the biggest difference, the biggest thing that you need to adjust between, your athletes that are bigger and stronger and further along in puberty and your athletes that are further behind. But probably the piece that runs through all of that is technically they have to be really sound. And so what we focus a lot on is the actual technical aspect of the exercise. And you can't move on and you can't move to the next exercise and you can't add weight until technically you're where you need to be. But it's less about age and it's more about, I guess you could say, ability level. So we have some kids that are on the younger end, but they've been with us for a couple of years and they're pretty advanced when it comes to their training levels. I think I talked about the supplements. A question here about how do you train the nervous system versus train muscles? So that's a great question. That's what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks, but I'm trying to think about how to boil it down and simplify it here. So the key factor when you're training the nervous system is that you match all of the qualities of the movement that you're trying to improve with the exercise that you choose. And the qualities to focus on are the force and the velocity. So how much load and how fast are you moving? And then the movement pattern. So the movement pattern determines the sequence of muscular firing that needs to occur in the body. And the sequence of firing is controlled by your nervous system. The force velocity relationship that determines, it's called recruitment and rate coding. And recruitment and rate coding is controlled by the nervous system. So those are the two big factors. The last one is metabolics, and it's not as important. But the two big factors are you have to match the movement and you have to match the force and velocity. And if you match those, then the nervous system is being asked to act in the same way during the exercise as it will be during the performance. And so the nervous system will be trained to do that. You want to also have the same amount of rest is helpful. If you want to, so like the way that we train in the gym is we try to sort of mimic what a shift would look like. And we do that over and over and over throughout the entire hour that our athletes are here. And like I said before, hockey is a repeated sprint ability sport. So it's explosive and then you have a little bit of a rest, and explosive and then a little bit of a rest. You do that a couple of times and then you have a longer rest. And so we kind of build that into the way that we run things. Training muscles, on the other hand, is all about, they call it protein degradation. It's about breaking down the proteins of the muscle. The way that you do that is you do submaximal work. So you do 8 to 12 reps. You do it repeated, and you do it with very little rest. So like 30 seconds of rest. So that's a hypertrophy or a bodybuilding method. And so what you would do is you would choose sort of an isolating exercise, something that works on like just a couple of muscles. And you'll do that until your muscle is exhausted, and then you wait 30 seconds, and then you do it again, and then you wait 30 seconds. Maybe take a little bit of weight off the bar, and then you do it again. That's a way to target the tissue. Your nervous system, if you want to train that, you want to do things that are more explosive, and you want to rest a little bit longer in between. I don't think that's a very good answer, but I'll talk more about it in 2 weeks and in more detail because it's kind of a bigger topic area to unpack.